You go to Astrobot though, 55% of Astrobot sales were physical. So more people bought that game in the box than they did as a download.
We know that the industry has been struggling in general for the last few years, and the government of Quebec last year took a look at everything that was happening and decided, now is exactly the time when we want to be kind of messing with this whole tax credit thing.
Hello and welcome back to the Game Business Show. This week, physical games retail is on its knees, and I'll share why, even in 2025, this is a real challenge for video game companies. Bungie's marathon has been revealed, and the internet, or at least the social media algorithms, are skeptical about it. The US tariffs continue to play havoc and threaten to play even more havoc on an already beaten up video game industry. And Shuhei Yoshida's extended retirement tour continues, with criticism aimed at Nintendo Switch 2, a console I actually got to play this week. But first, let me introduce our guest host for the week, someone I spent the best part of 8 years working besides and remains one of the very best journalists I've ever worked with. It's Brendan Sinclair. Hello, Brendan.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me.
There's the patent enthusiasm I love. Welcome to the show. You're at The Logic now. What's The Logic? What's that about?
The Logic is a Canadian business and tech website. We cover just news with a distinctly Canadian angle. So I'm still getting to write about the video game industry here and there, but mostly where it intersects with, Canadian interests.
Well, I did see a piece, which you may have sent me a few weeks ago about the tax break situation in Canada. It seems like it's gone a bit wrong. Yeah,
so this is a fascinating story that's been playing out in the industry here, is just what's happening with Quebec and Montreal. For the longest time, when you talk about the Montreal development scene, it's there's tax credits there. The government's paying them to be there. And that's why Ubisoft, Warner Brothers, Eidos, Square Enix, that's why all these giant companies came. And we know that the industry has been struggling in general for the last few years. And the government of Quebec last year took a look at everything that was happening and decided, now is exactly the time when we want to be kind of messing with this whole tax credit thing. They've changed it up. They haven't cut it entirely. They've made it a little bit less generous. And one of the big things is that they're taking the first 18,000 or something of every employee's salary is not eligible for the tax credit. And the problem with that is that you've got a lot of businesses in Montreal and Quebec that have been there for, decades relying on this, because this tax credit was in the 90s that it was introduced. And they've kind of baked it into all of their business dealings for this is how we make our profit. And some of them, service providers of the keywords sort, localization, Q&A, testing, they tend to run on very thin margins. They get by doing a lot of work. Also, those people might not be paid the best. So if you've suddenly got, a whole bunch of people making $50,000 to do your QA testing, and then a third of the tax credit on that is no longer, you're not getting that money back from the government, that could very easily take what is a profitable and sustainable business and push it onto the other side of the ledger. So this is just the tax credit changes at the same time Ubisoft, we know they're having issues.
Yeah.
And Ubisoft, they employ about a third of the Quebec game development scene. The studio in Montreal is huge. It's almost 4,000 people. They've got Quebec City, Saguenay, the Hybrid VFX studio is in Quebec. Ubisoft is such a load-bearing pillar of the Quebec game industry. And they're having a tough time of it right now. And suddenly these changes come in, and that could threaten to destabilize the industry in some really interesting ways, I think. We talk about the wider story in video games right now, which is tariffs, and how the uncertainty of what it's going to be like tomorrow versus what it's like today, and how that just taints everything and puts a blanket on any kind of investment. And for the most part, software developers have been exempt from these sort of tariffs. But this is a situation in Quebec with the tax credits where now that we've seen things like the Quebec government scaling back on them, in 2019, Alberta had a Conservative Party government that was elected, and one of the first things that they did was get rid of the tax credit that Alberta had, which did not help BioWare very much at all.
No.
These tax credits, just because now companies know they can go away, which they always could technically, but if you didn't have cautionary tales to point to say like, oh, wow, yeah, that really messed over these companies. Yeah, now I think they're very much more aware of this, and that makes the tax credits less enticing than they were before, because there is some uncertainty surrounding them. Although it is a Canada, Quebec specific story here, I think it has a lot of implications for the wider industry. Any place that there are tax credits, or any place that you have companies looking to find, inexpensive labor pools to send element off to. So it's all tied up in this big knot of uncertainty surrounding the industry right now. And I worry, but I'm a worrier. So.
Well, I think it's interesting because in the UK, we hated the tax credits. For years, there was this campaign about how the brain drain in the UK dev scene was caused by that everyone was going over to Canada to work because that's where all the big studios are being formed because they had all the tax breaks. So the UK's reaction to that eventually was to introduce its own tax breaks. And now we're starting to see more and more places just have these tax breaks. And there's a train of thought to go, actually, if we've all got tax breaks, do we need any tax breaks? And I guess that becomes when you're just sort of cancelling each other out a little bit. And now we're starting to see people open up places in areas that just have low labor costs or, exchange rates and places like that, where you're right, you could open a studio in the UK, but the UK has got a series of different challenges linked to Brexit and stuff. Is it better off to outsource or QA to India or things like that? But it's coming at with all these talent pools, these groups of people who have, set up homes and places where where there's a blossoming game development scene. If that suddenly becomes under threat, if Ubisoft was to close any of its Canadian studios or do anything in that regard, I mean, I should think they wouldn't. Or even if it's just, they severely, reduce the size of that team. That's a lot of, talent in that space looking for work. And there's not much incentive necessarily to set up there, I guess, in the same way that there was before.
Yeah. I look at the tax credit issue. I've always been fascinated by it because on the one hand, look at Quebec as an example of what tax credits can do for a development scene. It turned Montreal specifically into a worldwide development hub, and some amazing games have come from it. And there is a development scene there now that owes a lot to the tax credits, even if they were mostly AAA kind of developers taking advantage of it originally. Now you've got like Sabotage, Thunder Lotus, Kit Fox games. Like there is a scene, Red Barrels, of independent developers, publishers in Montreal, in Quebec, that are, globally relevant and producing exactly the kind of successful businesses and culturally relevant work that was sort of like a best case scenario for the tax credits. But on the other hand, is this something that the government should be doing, is like picking sectors that are, we are going to privilege this sector over some other generic IT firm or some other little corner of the economy. And I'm not sold on whether or not they definitely should be. But once you start doing it, once you build something like this, then you have, a thriving sector that is dependent on these tax credits. And it really is, like you were saying, an arms race, where a lot of other people have been accelerating their own tax credit programs. And British Columbia, a couple months ago, they extended their tax credit. They expanded it from like 17.5% to 25%. And they made it permanent because before it was like, we need to renew this every few years. And so there's other people going in the opposite direction with it. In some ways, they painted themselves into a corner here.
Yeah.
It's like, if you're going to do this, then you really got to kind of do it and stick to it for the people that have been attracted by the tax credit, that were like, okay, we're going to invest in your region because of that, and we're going to build our businesses. Or when you have the tax credit, communicate that it is, this is a temporary boost.
One of the biggest issue I see is that the tax credits, and they change now that they're sort of encouraging people to hire more senior staff and not bring through the juniors? Isn't that part of the changes?
Yeah. So it used to be that there was a cap on the total salaries. Like you'd get the tax credit on up to $100,000 of each employee's salary. And now they're like, cap's not there. And that really sort of pushes people to hire the more experienced developers because they want more senior people, more influential decision makers to be located in Quebec. They want the heart of the business to be there. One of the biggest complaints about the tax credit that critics have had, I think, in the recent decades is just that it has mostly been foreign companies that have thrived with the tax credit. Ubisoft is a French company. Square Enix, Japan. Yeah. Eidos was
UK.
Yeah. And Behavior Interactive is the largest homegrown, like Canadian-owned success story. They've done fantastic, especially with Dead by Daylight, but they are an outlier. Mm-hmm. And so the thinking was that these tax credits, they're really just helping these foreign companies. Canada doesn't own any of this. We're making money and sending it off to the IP owners in other countries.
Yeah.
That's been an issue.
Yeah. Well, let's switch to an even more challenging topic, which is our main one for this week, which is about video games retail. Now, the reason why this was going to be our main topic this week is I had a story, not the biggest story in the world, but certainly a story. Unfortunately, I sat on it for too long and it got out there last week, which is the UK retailer Game is closing its HQ and its warehouse. Game is owned by a retail group called Fraser's Group, who are most famous for the Sports Direct stores. They have been really causing havoc at Game. In recent times, they've merged game systems with their own, which means that game stores are unable to do pre-orders. They're unable to do pre-owned anymore. So Game is no longer able to do the basic things that games retailers are sort of known for. If you talk to game store staff, and I don't just mean the store managers, I mean people in that head office, they're a bit of dismay at the situation. They are hoping things will stabilize and they can start reintroducing some of the things that have been taken away. And although I do appreciate that optimism, my experience of this stuff is that it rarely goes back. As a negative story for the UK scene, very specific story, but it's not the only one if you've been paying attention to the news lately. GfK retail data, again, this is for the UK. I do have some European data as well. So that physical video games fell by 26% in volume in 2024 and 34.5% in revenue in 2024, which is a startling figure. For the first quarter of this year, physical video game sales are down 29% in volume and 27% in revenue. It's not stabilizing in any way. Now, a lot of that decline is because of the Nintendo Switch. Nintendo is a dominant player in the physical games market, which we'll come back to a few times. It had a weaker release slate last year. It didn't have it had a Zelda game, but it didn't have its big Zelda game like it had in 2023. It had a Mario game in 2023. As a result, in the UK, 4.4 million Switch games were sold in the UK last year, which is still more than anyone else. But that's a drop of 1.8 million games over the year before. By contrast, PS5, which is also relatively retail friendly, not as retail friendly as Nintendo, but relatively, they saw a drop of 800,000 units in 2024. PS4 saw a drop of 600,000 units. They went from 1.8 million PS4 games sold in 2023 to 1.2 million. Xbox, they've never been the biggest at retail, but that dropped by 300,000 games in 2024 as well. So everyone dropped. But if you kept up with all of that, the drop in the number of physical Switch games sold was bigger than the drop of PS4 drop, the PS5 drop, the Xbox Series X drop, and actually the Xbox One drop combined. So Nintendo has a down year, retail has a down year. That was just the UK, and say similar story in Europe. In terms of units sold in 2024, physical game sales were down 22% to 56.5 million units. That's GSD data. And again, this was primarily driven, although not exclusively, but primarily driven by a drop in Nintendo Switch game sales. Now, considering this, you might be thinking, okay, but there are a lot more Nintendo games this year, including some pretty huge ones in Mario Kart World and also Pokemon Legends ZA, which are games that typically sell millions in boxes. Across Europe, new game releases on Switch can account for up to 80% of its sales can come from the physical games market. I garbled that, but basically 80% of new physical games on Switch can come from physical. So it's a big deal. And there's also other games like Metroid and Donkey Kong. So it's potentially a strong year this year. But then came the other killer blow, which is during the Switch 2 reveal. we talked about this a little bit on the Switch 2 podcast, but Switch 2 games will be cheaper digitally than they are physically. And this was actually a shocker for me, more shocking than anything that came out of that Switch 2 reveal. Because no major games company, no platform holder has priced digital below physical before, in part to protect the physical retail stores, which, amongst other reasons. So for that to happen here and for Nintendo to be the one doing it, one of the most physical retail friendly companies, I didn't see that coming. As I said, we had Game on the podcast a couple of weeks ago when that news came out, and he kindly said that he understood the decision, but admitted it was a challenge for them. And it is. If by doing this, Nintendo significantly increases the digital market share for its games, then that will be a real blow to what's left of games retail. It's certainly been a string of bad stories for physical games retail. And you can understand why Nintendo would do this. Cartridge costs are high, and they want to try and keep the pricing down where they can. But also, if physical games retail is dying, if it is going away, being so dependent on the box sector for game sales is not a great situation to be in. So growing those eShop sales has got to be a priority. So yeah, bad news for shops. Physical game sales down by as much of a quarter last year, and the company responsible for the biggest slice of the physical games is pushing digital with cheaper pricing. It feels, it's if you're working in that side of the industry, it's quite bad. I don't know what it's like. The physical retail scene's drastically changed anyway. There's barely any presence of video games on the high street. I don't know what it's like in Canada, Brendan, but I'm guessing it's a similar situation.
Yeah, it's not good. There's GameStops here, and they are the same as what I hear everywhere else, I think, where it's like mostly Funko Pop and other merch. And then there's a shelf two of the games. Toys R Us here got rid of their game shelving section. We still have a Toys R Us, which is nice. But they got rid of the game shelving section, and they replaced it with a pop-up store for HMV so that they could sell vinyl.
Yeah.
So it's records. The dominant entertainment media form of the 70s and early 80s has replaced video games on the shelves, because that's viable business than physical games here. And yeah, the Nintendo pricing thing is interesting to me, because I think digital has always been cheaper than physical, generally speaking, but mostly that's just because you get deals afterwards that go deeper, and you wind up with humble bundle kind of stuff where they just shovel games you'll never play that you can add to your backlog for a few bucks a pop. It's interesting that they are splitting the price now for new releases, like day one, that digital would be cheaper than physical. I think that sounds like the actual significance here, but we've been paying a premium for the physical version in other media for a while. Blu-rays or the vinyls that you get at Toys R Us now. iTunes was just sort of like when it launched and it was like $10 an album or whatever. That was already undercutting the cost of a new physical CD. So it doesn't strike me as being that much of now we're doomed, because I think like physical was kind of doomed before, and it will transition to the period where it exists, but it is very much a niche sort of that charges a premium. And the question is whether, you might be getting to this, whether or not the hardware makers will actually still include cartridge slots or disk drives or things like that, which drive up the cost so that you can enable a physical opportunity.
Well, it's worth talking about the fact that, so I mentioned that number, that headline number, like in terms of revenue down by a third in terms of video game sales. But I think it's worth stating this is a problem for certain parts of the market. So I mentioned Nintendo, right? So I said Nintendo, 80% of new game sales for them when they release a new game is sold in a box. So if the box set game set was just disappear overnight, if there are fewer people selling boxes, or if that kind of thing, then that's a problem for Nintendo. But it's not just Nintendo, obviously. Video game consoles and accessories are dependent on retail. You can't download a headset. But even certain types of games. So here's some data. Obviously, naturally, this is me. Big action shooter games are typically very digital. So in the UK last year, nearly 81% of Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2 sales were sold via digital retailers. And this was also the case, broadly speaking, across Europe. Sports games, a little less, but still very high. So 73% of EA Sports FC 25 sales, such a name, were digital. 76% of F1 24 sales were digital and 70% of WWE 2K24 sales were digital. So still very digital. You go to Astrobot though, 55% of Astrobot sales were physical. So more people bought that game in the box than they did as a download. And there are others that's like Hogwarts Legacy. So one of the biggest games of the last 2 years. In the UK, 45% of that game sales were physical. You go back to 2023, more people bought Spider-Man 2 in a box than they did at launch anyway, than they did as a download. Now that might have been because of some hardware bundling, but it's still, more people bought it from shops than they did from digital stores. Assassin's Creed Mirage, 49% of sales were in a box. Resident Evil 4, 45% of sales were in a box. Now you might say that, you go digital only or the physical goes away, people will just move to digital. And that's probably true. And in fact, even in the physical space, in the UK, over 80% of all the revenue made on physical video games were made via online retailers like Amazon. So less than 20% of physical game sales were actually made in actual shops, like we get on a high street or in shopping malls or in retail parks. But although some will, maybe even a lot of customers will move to digital, there will be some lost customers. And today's world where the focus is on, we're trying to get growth back to the games industry. And one of the things that I think is a problem with growth is that every games company at the moment is focused on increasing the average revenue per user. So they're just trying to get people to pay more for the games rather than trying to necessarily widen the pool of players, because that's proving to be quite difficult at the moment. That's not necessarily an issue on an individual company basis. Profit is obviously paramount at the moment. But from an industry point of view, we need to try and grow the audience for games. I think that's the only way we as an industry can get back to proper growth, is if we unlock new customers. And the death of games retail does not help that. But at the same time, there's no going back. We're in the situation we're in. But I do think there's a lot we can learn, the digital space we can learn from retailers. I've seen a bunch of people that I used to work with when I used to work at MCV, which was a retail magazine. There are lots of the store managers, sort of retail buyers and people that worked in retail teams are now cropping up at game publishers. And I think that's quite smart, because when it comes to discoverability crisis, when it comes to convincing customers they're actually getting a good deal on the things that they're buying, which is a big topic at the moment, we can talk about that a little bit. I think retailers are actually quite good at handling these situations. They're kind of the experts in this area. So it might be worthwhile bringing some of these people into those publishing. There used to be a time where you could buy your game from 10 stores. You could go to Blockbuster, you could go to GameStop, you can go to Walmart, you can go to Best Buy, you can go to all these different places to buy video games. Now, there's basically in the console space, there's basically 3 retailers, eShop, 4, Amazon, eShop, PlayStation Store, and the Xbox Live, and it's the marketplace. And then that's it. I think there's room for us to get better there, learn from, because ultimately we can talk about how bemoan the death of retail, but it's happening and it's accelerating. And we as an industry that's trying to manage all of these other challenges that we're facing, growth challenges, tariff challenges, tax break challenges, we could do without losing customers because we don't have means for them to buy physical boxes. That's what I think. There's my rant.
I agree. And every transition creates problems and there are people that are left behind. But a lot of the criticisms that I have of the industry for how they have managed the transition to a digital world are more about the ways they've transitioned to a business model that allows for unlimited spending from each individual customer. I think the industry has shown a lot of restraint, on the other hand, on keeping retail as part of the equation for as long as they have.
Yes.
I think they had the technical ability to do, straight digital distribution. I mean, they showed it with the PSP Go, right? In the late 2000s. And yet they still stuck with supporting physical goods, not, pricing them differently until this point, and keeping GameStop, which was a thorn in the side of the industry for years and years. I don't think that they actively undermined them as enthusiastically as I would have expected, given what GameStop's business model was and given the volume of complaints that I used to hear about GameStop's business model.
What I find a little bit funny is a lot of that was around pre-owned. And one of the biggest complaints we get now, one of the biggest not complaints, I guess, but conversation points is, legacy game sales are so strong now, they're eating into new game sales. And the complaint obviously back then was pre-owned was killing legacy game sales. But obviously but the truth was there was actionable data that showed that, I think Game had a stat. It was like 91 or 92% of people that traded in their games at Game did so against new games. And obviously, and this is why we talk about pricing. I'm going to say, so you may have seen the Marathon news this week. There's a new Bungie game by Marathon, and fans are again, the social media algorithms are telling me everyone hates it. I'm sure that's not really the case. But there's a lot of conversation around the price of it and whether or not it's offering good value. And a lot of people point to the fact that, video game pricing has stayed the same for so long. And, $80 for Mario Kart World. When we factor in inflation, we're not really seeing a price rise at all. We might even be seeing a price drop, blah, blah, blah. And they're saying the same with the hardware as well. But I don't really go along with that argument completely, because that's what is technically happening with game pricing and what is really happening with game pricing. So I'll give you an example of this. And this may seem like I'm going to start off positive, but it's not entirely. So you can't escape the negativity around the Switch 2 pricing at the moment.
I can. I don't have to make a purchasing decision on Switch 2 yet.
Well, it certainly seems to be, if you're in the game space, every time I go on a Facebook wall, I see a big article. Well, interesting, I saw this article being pumped into my face, which was the full version of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild on Switch 2 will cost you $90. And that's based on the fact the game costs $60 on Switch 2. And if you want the DLC, it'll cost you another $30. And the idea being, I think, is to try and give the suggestion that if you want to upgrade your copy of Breath of the Wild to Switch 2, you have to pay an obscene amount of money. But obviously the headline's technically true, but in reality, that isn't true. Most people who want to play Breath of the Wild on Switch 2 probably already own Breath of the Wild and probably own the DLC as well, in which case the real price is $10. And if you happen to have a Nintendo Switch Online subscription service, it actually costs you nothing at all. And indeed, that's how much it's costing me. I actually think, I'm getting these two big game upgrades for nothing. Mario Kart World is actually a similar thing. So in the UK, the Mario Kart World, the box version that is £75. We've never seen a game be that high. So that's what all the headlines are. But millions and millions of people will be getting that game the way I'm getting that game, which is through the hardware bundle that they're promoting at the start. And the hardware bundle in the UK prices Mario Kart World at £35. In fact, it's the cheapest I've ever bought a Mario Kart game of all time. And of course, if you buy it digitally, it's a little bit less as well. So there's the technical truth in the headline that game prices are higher than ever, but the real price is actually less for a lot of people. But this was also the case 10, 15, 20 years ago. Games didn't cost £50 or $60 10, 15 years ago. They didn't. The recommended price might have said that, but that's not what people actually spent. Retailers would always knock a few dollars off. There'd always be a bit of a price war or competition. There were trade-in solutions. As I say, I remember going into Game with 4 old copies of titles like FIFA and getting a brand new one for £1. That's one of the offers they used to do quite a lot of. I think I bought Assassin's Creed 3 back in 2012 for £35, I think, from Tesco, I think it was, for Xbox 360 that was on. And in today's money, that's 50 quid. Whereas the only option I have for Assassin's Creed Shadows is £70. So I think there's what the real price was. And then there's what the real prices are today. And there is an increase in pricing. So I understand that. And going back to our point on the retail side of things, that's where retailers came in. They were really quite good at, giving you that. In a way, they used to call it basket spend. And you might have seen it as, I don't know. I always hated it when I went into a shop and someone was trying to tell me, hey, do you want to buy a controller with that? And buy this with that and buy that. And I know other people, they end up spending more and they end up feeling good about it. Whereas now I feel people are spending more and feeling terrible about it. I do think there's a retailing skill here that we've lost a little bit. I mean, I say that. It's Ubisoft Plus, the subscription service they've got, I think it's called Ubisoft Plus, basically allows you to rent Assassin's Creed Shadows for like $15 or whatever, or £15, which is, an interesting digital retailing solution. Nintendo used to do those vouchers you could buy where you could get 2 Switch games for reduced price if you got this voucher. And obviously when it comes to legacy games, as you mentioned, there's always these Steam sales, there's always these big promotions. I just don't think we necessarily go deep enough on that kind of thing when it comes to digital retailing. I think there's a way of getting, it sounds really mercenary, but sort of encouraging consumers to spend more whilst still making them feel good that they're getting a good value out of it and getting a good deal. I'm not sure they're feeling that at the moment, which I think is where a lot of this stress is. With the Switch 1, I got it for 100 quid less because I traded in my Wii U. And that's pretty much the case for every piece of hardware I had before that. And with the Switch 2, I don't have any option. Nobody's promoting a trade-in offer for the Switch OLED or whatever that I've got. I just have to buy it and have this old console sitting on my shelf.
Because there's no secondhand gaming market to sell the trade into now.
Yeah.
I will say your point of view is a little bit different from mine, because like you mentioned Tesco and that, and I remember a lot of complaining about that, about like supermarkets in the UK discounting the new release games. My memory of it in the US and Canada, to a lesser extent, is just that new games didn't really have sales like that around.
No, it was different. It was different in the UK. It was lots of price wars for a period of time in the UK.
And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing now digitally, is that there just is less competition. Because if everything's going through, the Nintendo eShop anyways, you're buying it from Nintendo. And I think people generally have like a platform that they prefer to play on, whether it's PC, Xbox, Switch, whatever, but they aren't likely to like look at the PlayStation version of this game is cheaper, so I'm going to go away from my main platform, if it's Steam or if it's Switch or whatever, and get the PlayStation version for that. I think it would have to be really like a deep cut to actually win people over for that. And that you don't get those kind of cuts on new release games these days. I think the best you get is like, a 10% discount at launch from the digital storefront. And that's not about competing with other storefronts, I think. It's just about getting you to actually pull the trigger on a purchase right away. So when consumers don't have choices between competitors that are engaged in the kind of aggressive pricing that you were talking about, it's not going to happen that these prices magically get offered at a nicer price point. So like, I think the hobby is, despite the advent of free to play, I think it is getting less affordable. And you can see that even in the equipment that you need to buy it. It's super weird to me that they raised the price of the PS5 again. I look at where the industry has been heading in the last 5 years, and stuff just doesn't get cheaper anymore. And then there was a pandemic, supply chain problems, and now there's tariffs and trade wars and everything. But we have not seen things budge towards being cheaper. Like, has anyone had price cuts?
No, we're going the other way. Everything's getting more expensive. And I understand why. I'm a business journalist. I get what's going on here. But I mean, there's a prominent games industry person said to me, opera used to be the most popular entertainment form in the world, or one of them. He said we can't bank on video games forever being, you can bank on it being around forever. You can bank on artists creating stuff and everybody wanting to support those artists and buy those things. But the business component of it, whether you love it or not, is what drives all of this big, expansive investments and concepts and money, and lots of people can make a living out of it. And that I just think it requires an element of audience growth. And the fact that we've got to this point where it seems to have slowed, and increasing those prices and making it more prohibitive, I don't think that solves the overall industry problem. But, it might solve the problem in the short term, but I think there just needs to get to a point of how do you, it's interesting. I talked to Jackbox Games this week about their service they're doing with Amazon, where they're trying to get games into the hands of everybody as easy as possible. Netflix talking about how they're trying to get their hands into the games. So when they tell me these stories and I do these pieces and I get a few gamers commenting on it going, oh, he's going to play that stuff on Netflix. I'm like, yeah, but it's quite accessible, relatively cheap way of playing video games. And I don't think there's enough of those generally, that except for the ones that are filled with microtransactions or things like that. The ability to be able to play a video game from start to finish in an affordable way, I think is something that we ought to still be thinking about as a business. But it's certainly a challenging time. And I think the loss of games retail, it's not new. It's like, I'm not talking about something that's, games retail was here yesterday and it's gone now. It's been fading away and fading away and fading away. But some of that data I showed that for some games, it's still really, really, really important, even vital. And so finding those ways of reaching those people, and I think it's going to still be an important thing. Anyway.
You mentioned Netflix. I've downloaded a few of the Netflix games on my phone and played through them. And there's some really great games. It kills me because I look at it and I'm just like, this is still too much friction. It's super easy to download the Netflix version of the game. And if you're already signed into Netflix on your phone, then it's just, sign in there and you're good. But even that in today's world feels like more friction than a critical mass of people are going to be willing to sign up for. It's wild to me just how you need to like connect the feedback straight up to the consumer's head. And then you need to pump your slurry of content directly down their gullet. Because if there is any kind of like activity required on their end, it's just like, oh yeah, but I've already got all these other things that I'm hooked up to.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I'll be honest, that's one of the thinking behind the game business. That's not, I wouldn't phrase it like that, certainly. But the whole reason why we're doing these in podcasts, we have videos, it's in the newsletter. You'll be able to read a lot of these people thoughts in the newsletter if you haven't already. It's on our social media feeds. Is because rather than expecting consumers to come to us because they're so busy, they've got so much stuff being thrown at them all the time, I'm just going to go to them and that you go, here you go, here it is. And that is what entertainment is today. And Netflix are trying to do new things with like TVs and phones, and Jackbox want to be like on TVs and things like that. It feels almost like a different conversation. Shall we talk about tariffs very briefly? It's a comparatively quiet week for tariffs. We did have the news at the weekend that electronics are temporarily, PCs and mobile phones anyway, temporarily exempt from the tariffs. Is actually linked to the Section 232, I think it's what it's called, investigation into semiconductors, which means the tariffs are almost certainly still coming, but and maybe even in a worse way than possible. But consoles were never exempt. Neither were controllers, neither were merchandise or any of the products. Switch 2 cartridges were, which was a relative boost for the physical sales of the Switch 2 games. But the reality, it's getting quite messy now. It's getting quite complicated. And it's still not entirely clear what impact, this is the thing with a lot of people have said to me on social media, well, can't they just manufacture these things in the US? And not only do it take years to get this stuff spun up, to get the expertise, to build the factories and the warehouses and do all of the things that's required there, certain metals don't even exist in the US. They have to be imported anyway. So you end up in a situation where you'd still be impacted by tariffs. The price of these products with tariffs being proposed one way or another is just going to rise. And that's a real problem for video games right now. It's a real stress point at this point in 2025 was supposed to be the year we got back to growth. It was supposed to be the year that a new console and a couple of big games was going to, at least in a short term, give us a bit of a bump. And then this comes along, creates this whole world of uncertainty, and it's going to impact everything from investment. We're already seeing consumers in China protesting it by refusing to buy American goods. You're already seeing that actually in Europe as well. I'm not sure that's definitely going to extend to games. Even if these things, everyone sort of walks away from it somehow saving the face and tariffs disappear, I still think there's going to be some sort of harm from a consumer point of view in terms of their perception and view of things. I don't have much to say. There's an article on the game business, which I put up, which is like an FAQ on what the latest is, and I will be updating it as soon as something else happens, which, by the way, may be the case. It's twice I've done these shows, Brendan, had to cut out or add in something after recording because something has happened by the time I've recorded this and the time we put it live. And that may be the case now. So if this sounds out of date to you, then read the article in the game business. I will have updated it.
Yeah. So when you were talking there, it just reminded me of like, well, in Canada, we're not exactly thrilled about buying American these days.
No.
And I think there's the last few months, the turmoil of it, I think have made clear to a lot of people that they can't rely on trade with the US the way they used to. It was taken as a given that there would be access to the US market, especially in Canada. We have a subscriber survey for the Logic that we're running right now about how have the tariffs impacted your organization. And the last question on it is, do you think that trade relations with the US will ever go back to the way they were? And it's still running. I guess it'll be closed by the time that this actually airs. But taking a peek at the early results anyways, it was something like 80% of the people were saying no. It just won't be the same. And our prime minister at the moment, we're in the middle of an election campaign, Mark Carney is saying like that era of close Canadian cooperation with the US and economic and military ties that we had, that era is over. We're absolutely willing to resume better trade deals and situations with them, but we cannot go back to the kind of interdependence that we had taken for granted for decades. And I think a lot of the world looking at this has to come to the same conclusion, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a manufacturer selling things from China or Vietnam, you have to understand that even if there is an administration change here and you get someone that is more in the mold of past presidents, that return to normalcy or whatever is one election away from just evaporating. There is no certainty with the US in the way that basically the entire world used to think there was. So this is not a temporary situation that will, everything goes back to normal. We are looking at a readjustment that will change the way, obviously games, but everything operates going forward. And genie is out of the bottle. And you're going to see people doing more working around the United States, I think. You'll also see a lot of companies moving into the United States to make things in the US and sell things to Americans. But I don't think there will be the same utter reliance and dependence on the market that they're used to.
Yeah. But from a games point of view, obviously it's the biggest market for video games in the world, particularly console games. And if you can't sell the hardware there, or you can't sell it at a reasonable cost, the impact is on jobs. And it's on jobs, it's worth noting that US makes some of the biggest video games in the world. And this will impact those companies, those software companies. I mean, it's worth noting in 2019, the ESA and some others managed to convince the government not to impose tariffs when the tariffs on China to impact games consoles. It's possible they could do that this time. There's still opportunities, and we'll obviously be keeping on top of all of that. I will end by, it's a bit of a long one, this one, but we'll end on one, hopefully, sort of lighter note, an unusually critical note, I guess. Shuei Yoshida has his extended retirement tour going around talking about everything. Clearly the muzzle is off, but he had a pop at Nintendo this week, sort of. He referred to the reveal of the Switch 2 as being a mixed message. I think Nintendo is losing their identity, in my opinion. For me, they're always about creating some new experiences, like designing hardware and games together to create an amazing new experience. But Switch 2, as we anticipated, is a better Switch, right? It's the larger screen, more powerful processor, higher resolution. They even had a hardware person starting the screen like other platforms do. It pops into be that the Switch 2 isn't innovative enough. I'm not sure. I understand where this comes from, but I think someone like Shu has been around long enough to know that actually this is more in Nintendo's MO than I think people realize. The SNES was a more powerful NES with more buttons. The GameCube was a more powerful N64 with more buttons. The GBA was a more powerful Game Boy with some more buttons. Even the 3DS, I would argue, I know it had a 3D screen, but just a DS, a more powerful DS. The Wii U, in a way, is the only exception, following the Wii with a new innovation as opposed to just a more powerful Wii. For me, the Switch 2 being a more powerful version of the Switch is just what Nintendo often do with their second consoles. And so I'm not entirely sure I agree. And also, I think the game chat functionality, I played Mario Kart World, I'll talk about that in a moment. So I'm not entirely sure I agree with him, but it's certainly a bit of a consensus at the moment that the Switch 2 is too similar to the Switch 1. I'm not going to give you my opinion, though. I'm going to cut to myself from last week when I just played the Switch 2. I played Mario Kart, I played Metroid, I played Donkey Kong, I played a bunch of games at an event in London, and I was joined by Andy Robinson from Video Game Chronicle to share his views on it as well. Let's cut to that clip. We are at the Nintendo Switch 2 launch event in London. Preview event, I guess, press preview event. And I've played a bunch of Nintendo Switch 2 games for the first time. But Andy, this is your second time.
Yes, indeed.
I'm joined by Andy Robinson of Video Games
Switch
Chronicle.
Switch 2 event stalwart at this stage.
Yeah.
I genuinely have been demoing some demos to press.
You did it to me just a minute ago. You told me where to go on the welcome tour.
I told them the actual staff to get out of the way.
Yeah.
Showed you around. Yeah.
Has anything changed your mind? Is there anything you liked? What was the...
The mouse controls probably convinced me more the second time around. I think it's easy to be a little bit cynical that obviously a 30, 40-year-old mechanic that we're also used to on our PCs, can that really be innovative, really be interesting on a console just by itself? But there's a lot of demos here that I got to spend a bit more time with, like Mario Party, for example, where they demonstrate that the force feedback that they're calling HD Rumble 2, I know that was a big gimmick on the first Switch, but combining that with a traditional mouse actually does really work. It feels like more tangible. Like there's a mini game on Mario Party where you pull a toy car, as you would in real life, to charge it up and then release it. And you can feel the tension in the mouse as you do it through the force feedback. And it elevates the experience more than if you were just on a PC, for example.
I used the mouse controls on Metroid, and I was quite impressed at how you use the mouse controls, and then to switch to normal controls,
yes, it's seamless. Yeah.
You just lift it up, and it's
that's seamless. And the way I played the Metroid demo was in the more explorative moments, I would play with gyro controls traditionally, and then when I needed more precision, say on a boss fight, for example, I'd switch to the mouse. So that is quite cool. Yeah, it is.
What did you make of? Because I played Mario Kart. There's two types of demos here. Yes. I played the Grand Prix, which was great. Mario Kart, basically. And then I played what was the name of the mode? The knockout mode, which is
it's excellent.
It's excellent. Absolutely game changer. Also, there's a bit of free roaming beforehand, which I could see people enjoying with a bit of game chat on between. But I thought that was astonishing. And my initial thoughts were, I feel sorry for that Sonic racing game that's coming out this year.
Oh, goodness gracious, yeah. It's just by itself, it's Mario Kart on such a larger scale. The tracks are interconnected, they're seamless. That mode demonstrates better than anything we've seen in any demo so far what they're trying to achieve with this title. In the knockout mode, you play through 4 courses that are directly connected. You'll go through a city, and then you'll go through a desert canyon, and then you'll be in a swamp, and it's all completely seamless. You don't really get to see that in traditional GP. But just by itself, the races, there's 24 players this time. It's complete carnage by the end, right? You can... Playing is believing.
I think it gets less carnage as it goes on. That's because it starts off with so many players because you knock out as you go for each checkpoint.
So it's a lot of fun. That really convinced me. As a fan, I wasn't sure before we got to see the big Switch 2 Direct whether a Mario Kart game could really carry for me a launch lineup.
I was expecting Donkey Kong, basically Mario, but with Donkey Kong, and it's not what that game is. And obviously because Mario Kart is clearly the hero title, it's not. Will it get the same focus when it comes out? It's only out a month later.
I mean, you always have to attach a caveat when you're being critical of a Nintendo game that we're judging it on a Nintendo scale, right? Yeah. It's clearly going to be a very, very good game. I have a lot of faith into it, but I agree with you. It's very limited. It's a small demo for what's presumably a very big game, and I'm still unconvinced just how good the core mechanic is, the destruction, the smashing through stuff. I've been told that perhaps it would be better in a normal playing environment because the sound is supposed to really elevate, kind of the feedback of smashing through the scenery. But still, I've got a lot of question marks around it. I'm eager to see more of what that game's about.
It's interesting. I really enjoyed the Metro demo, but it felt more like a demo built for like a space like this than a Metroid game. Yeah. And oddly, things like Welcome Tour, which I quite enjoyed. I remember really enjoying 1-2 Switch when I came to the Switch 1 event 8 years ago, and that obviously was a bit rubbish when it came out.
I think the press has become quite savvy now to which games are actually a lot more fun when you're playing them at an event with lots of other journalists playing with you, with basically staff excitedly cheering you on. Yeah. I think we probably attach that caveat to the Mario Kart Knockout Tour as well. How fun is that going to be in a real world environment when you're getting absolutely battered by 23 other 13-year-olds from Eastern Europe.
Oh, you're surrounded by people screaming, go! When you click
we'll get a different kind of screaming, presumably when you're playing on real Switch. If you paid for your game chat anyway.
Well, I've pre-ordered it. I'm excited for the console. Mario Kart does look like a step up. Donkey Kong, I'm not too sure about. I enjoyed Welcome Tour. I enjoyed Metroid. It does feel like a continuation of the Switch story, rather than a reset. And I don't know why. I always expected that. It's kind of what people wanted. It's what I'm asking for. But I think when I see it, I'm like, this is just my console carrying on. A lot more powerful. Here's the next batch of games. Some of them, Metroid, will be playable on the older one. And go ahead, which isn't quite as exciting as it used to be, but I think that's
consoles now. That's consoles. This is Nintendo's PS5, Xbox Series X moment, right, where we turn the console on expecting a brand new experience, or older people like us do, and you're like, all my games are there, and it's a smoother it's not the big reset that we've been trained to get used to, but. Maybe that's a great thing, right? It's a better Switch. I really think that pretty much anything is going to be able to run on this console now. If it can run PS4 games, then it can run pretty much anything, right?
Yeah, and obviously with modern developers going cross-generation, and it fits that. Well, thank you, Andy. Thank you for your opinions, and I'll go back to myself in the studio. that was my take on the Switch 2 after I played it. Brendan, have you been paying attention to Switch 2? You're not much of a Nintendo person, are you, Brendan?
I am.
You are a Nintendo person.
I've been much more of a Nintendo person than I think the Vita dying was what did it to me. After the Vita, I've been pretty much all Nintendo since then. But yeah, like I've been paying enough attention, and I mean, for years beforehand, I think a lot of people, myself included, were saying, look, Nintendo, we know about your whole innovation thing. You want to do new things. This time, please, just more powerful, the same thing. Do the obvious for once. Don't do like an innovation and force it in there and it sucks. Don't do that. Don't try and catch lightning in a bottle a second time. And they listened to us. So now this is what we asked for. So be happy with it. But I don't think of it as like a sign that Nintendo has clearly lost its way or anything. I do think we're probably seeing like a more clear glimpse of what Nintendo is like in the future without, I mean, they haven't had Iwata at the helm for a while now, but Iwata was, behind the Switch. Miyamoto is, I mean, hopefully he's taking it easier these days.
Making movies.
or
making
just
movies and museums, and he's in that space, isn't he?
Yeah, like he is not going to be driving Nintendo forward in the future the way that he always has been in the past. And Nintendo was not just Iwata and Miyamoto. There's, an entire organization of hundreds, thousands of people that have, a lot of them been there for a very long time and are part of the fabric and the DNA of the company. So it's not like evaporating overnight or anything. But you have a transition in leadership here, and that's going to have, impacts on the way the company looks, what it does.
I guess maybe from a hardware point of view, but Donkey Kong Bonanza is completely different to anything I expected it to be. I'm not sure I liked it, as I said, but there was Dragon Drive, and there was all the sort of stuff that you expect from the Nintendo weirdness. It just didn't necessarily come through in the hardware. It's a sort of, it's the software side of things. I think the most innovative thing they did with the 3DS was never the 3D screen. It was the Street Pass stuff. That's the stuff I want to see about. But anyway, that's. I think we've run out of time, Brendan. As is always the case, always zips by when I'm talking to you.
Or when we talk Nintendo.
Certainly when we talk Nintendo. I'm probably a little bit quiet on Nintendo for a few weeks now. It has dominated the agenda a little bit alongside tariffs. Well, hopefully next week there will be a little bit, we'll have some other new stuff next week, or we've also talked a lot about movies lately and Minecraft films. But next week we will have a special feature show with another game studio, which you can stay tuned for that on the Tuesday. And then we'll be back for our news analysis show next Thursday. Brendan, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to be talking to you about video games again. And for everyone watching at home or listening at home, thank you for tuning in.